Before we launch into an in-depth look at issues related to human diversity during the semester, it's worth reviewing a few basic sociological concepts that relate to this topic, and that's what this brief lecture will be focused upon. It's very important that we understand the cultures that surround our clients, that is, the larger dominant culture, as well as the ethnic culture that may be a part of a client's life as well, and how those cultures interact and impact our clients' lives. Every culture has strengths and positive qualities, but when we view those other cultures through the frameworks of our own cultures, we tend to see other cultures as inferior or deficient in many ways. And this is true for virtually every culture in society, not just the dominant culture. The demographics of our nation are changing, as we know, from being dominated by Northern European white cultures to a society that is going to be very rich in diversity with members of cultures from all over the globe and bringing many different ethnic values into the society as a whole. All fields of social work practice are going to be impacted by this, and it's going to require that social workers be willing to learn about the client's different cultures and also to approach this learning as a true learner, that is, to be asking questions and studying the cultures of other persons so that we are better able to understand our clients themselves. It's essential that we understand the nature of our society in regards to its mix of cultures. And in order to do that, we have to understand how majority and minority cultures interact and relate to each other in the cultures in which they exist. Also, how the institutions of society reinforce the system that is marked by oppression of minorities by the majority culture. And we need to see and understand how that impression impacts the lives of our clients. One way that oppression is implemented in a culture is through the concept of race. And the concepts of race and ethnicity are often used interchangeably and can be confused with each other, but they're really very different concepts. First of all, race is perceived, and I stress perceived, to be related to biological characteristics that distinguish one people from another. Generally speaking, when we think about race, when we talk about race, we're talking about skin color and certain characteristics that may be dominant in particular racial groups. Over time, we have come to recognize that race really is a social construct and it isn't biological, but we still tend to see this as biology. Ethnicity, on the other hand, represents the cultural characteristics of a group and generally include things that focus upon the country of origin and the foods and dress and language and customs and music and religions and those kinds of things that come with the culture. And so when you look at race and ethnicity, although again they're often used interchangeably, they're really very different things. Race is often oversimplified to describe skin color, but there are many groups represented in each racial group. Using biology and genetics to represent race tends to separate groups into sets of features which are very arbitrary and generally tend to suit the purpose of the labeler. Race then becomes an ascribed status based upon physical characteristics. And an ascribed status, of course, is a status that one is born into and is immutable throughout one's life. And if then one belongs to a racial group that is considered inferior in that society, that person is more or less doomed to be seen in that light throughout his life or her life. And there are certain fabrications which underlie a sense of race. One of them is that there's such a thing as a pure race. No such thing really exists at all. And when one believes in the existence of a pure race, then one also latches on to the notion that one race, obviously the pure race, is superior over other races. And this really is the basis that is used for establishing dominance of the group that is seen to be superior. Cultures and societies deal with diversity among its groups in different ways. There are three main ways in this particular way of seeing this issue. One is pluralism, and this is a society, and really this is what we tell ourselves America is all about, or what we once believed at least about America, that various groups coexist in respect and tolerance, maintaining their own unique traditions. And Americans used to point to such things as the existence of vibrant communities like Chinatown and Little Italy and those types of ethnic enclaves to point out the supposed fact that we accept different cultures and everything. And so pointing to the belief that we're a pluralistic society. But as, of course, we've come to realize, I think, and really thinkers, I think, have realized this all along, this is not a pluralistic society, but really is one that leans on domination by the majority being the Northern European whites that we talked about earlier, a domination by the majority over minority. Now, of course, majority isn't defined in numbers, although a lot of people worry about the fact that the dominant white Northern European culture is no longer be the largest numbered group in American society. Majority has nothing to do with numbers. It's about terms of relative power. And I would say that it is highly likely, even as the Northern European white group becomes not 50% of the population of America, it's still going to retain its majority status in power just because of the fact that it continues to hold very strong control over all the institutions of society. But that's for discussion later in the semester. The minority then is also not defined by numbers, but really, again, is defined by the relative power of members of the group. And really is defined as people singled out for unequal treatment and who see themselves as being the object of discrimination. The dominant group has greater power, greater privilege, greater status. I think in this particular way of seeing things, there are 4, 5, 6 different forms of domination, and going from one extreme to another. One is extermination, which really involves genocide, the absolute elimination of the minority group, the group that has less power. And there are many examples of this throughout even recent history. Of course, going back to World War II, perhaps the most infamous is the Nazi efforts to exterminate the Jews during the Holocaust. But we have seen more recent examples of this with the treatment of the Rohingya minority in Myanmar and the Tutsis in Rwanda. Many people would say also that as the European settlers have come to dominate North America, that they were engaged in extermination of the Native Americans. And if you look at the numbers of Native Americans on the continent pre-contact with Europeans and compared to their lowest numbers, I think early in the 1900s, it certainly does appear as though extermination is a proper term to use. Another form of domination by the majority over minority is expulsion, where entire groups are moved out of an area. And this infamously is in our own American history with the Trail of Tears, where the Native American tribes were relocated from the East Coast to less desirable lands west of the Mississippi in order to accommodate the desires of the European settlers to gain control of the East and the valuable lands there. Subjugation is another way to deal with domination in a society, and this is where the rights and privileges are denied to the minority group, and their lives and activities are controlled by the majority. This includes enslavement and, of course, slavery. We're very familiar with that topic from our own history. Segregation, and there are really two different types of segregation: de jure and de facto. De jure is by law, and so, for instance, in 1954 in Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional and ordered the orderly desegregation of schools. But segregation continued to be, in fact, still present in schools. And for that matter, long after it appears as though we have integrated the school system, we find that the schools in many respects are segregated for other reasons. And so de facto segregation in many communities continue, and certainly did long after the Supreme Court rulings. Not just in schools, by the way. Of course, this was true in many areas of life for African Americans during the latter half of the 20th century and continues today. The minority responses to segregation take all different kinds of forms, but include outright rebellion, separatist movements, social protest, and sometimes these kinds of responses to subjugation strengthens the oppressor and provides some endorsement of their desire to continue to exert even more control over the minority group. The third way, we've talked about, going back to the previous slide, we talked about different ways that the majority are controlling minority and a response to that, one being pluralism and then domination. And now the third method is assimilation, which involves the eventual disappearance of the minority group as it adopts features of the majority culture and is integrated into it. Socially speaking, perhaps American society engages in assimilation. I do believe that if we really looked at the way the majority deals with minority groups in America, however, we can see that subjugation continues to be very much the rule in many areas, if not socially, legally, at least economically. And in fact, even legally through the judicial system, we find far more minorities being held in prisons and places like that than the majority members. And again, a discussion for later in the semester. But assimilation is perhaps the way that a lot of people think that America handles minority relationships, so that the concept of assimilation to those individuals becomes that we welcome people from foreign countries, but they need to become American. And so you have laws where English is the official language. If you're going to be American, you need to speak English, and you need to respect the flag, and you need to not wear ethnic clothing and not have social customs that obviously contradict the kinds of things that most people in a society do. So assimilation may produce a change in the core culture, but the host culture remains really in control. And I think for the majority of individuals, the less that the minority culture is obvious in a core culture and an assimilation circumstance, the better it's seen that way. Now, assimilation, as families move into a culture, it is said that assimilation occurs over the course of 3 generations, so that the older generation, the generation that moves to the new culture, retains a strong connection to the old country. That's what my grandmother used to call it. She'd talk about the old country having come from Hungary. The next generation kind of has one foot in the former culture and one in the new culture, and there's a desire to become engaged in the new culture and to favor the new culture, and yet the older culture insists upon that connection to the home country or whatever. And then finally, the third generation sees themselves as detached from the host or from the old countries, and generally becomes deeply engaged in the new culture, and that's assimilation. That's how that process occurs. And when individuals resist assimilation in a desire to retain their group identity, this oftentimes engenders discrimination. And I would suggest to you they consider the way that the Muslims are and the dress that the women wear when they respect the religious traditions of that culture are often the point of upset in the larger culture. American culture dictates conformity to that white, Christian, middle-class, Northwest European society. Here's a continuum that actually I pulled from a sociology text that I taught years ago that kind of has these ways of dealing with diversity on a continuum, and you can see them kind of lined up, and each of them have their own definition there that kind of puts them on a continuum. So you can see that pluralism or multiculturalism is obviously the preferred response according to this way of thinking. Father Michael Alexa, if you've ever heard him speak, he talks about communicating across cultures. His communicating across cultures lectures, there were 4 of them that he did years ago, are just absolute gems. And I once had a hard copy of them and I lost them in the move. I accidentally threw them away. because they were on VCR. And I no longer had a VCR player. And I'd like to find a copy of that someday, a digital copy, so I can keep it. But he talked about looking at cultures, and he said, the concept of assimilation really is, kind of blending everything together so that you have this porridge, where everything was mixed together. And there might be little flavors of the other cultures, but by and large, the porridge remains the porridge. And in a multicultural society, he said, we're like a tossed salad, so that we all are mixed together and we all contribute to the larger dish, so to speak, but each individual group maintains its own qualities and stands together with the others to make a better whole. It's a good way to understand multiculturalism, I believe. Just a couple other basic ideas here. Again, these are things you're likely very familiar with, I'm sure. But, the concept of stereotype is really about beliefs, right? They're rigid and oversimplified beliefs about a particular group. And usually stereotypes are taught to us from a very early age and reinforced through our socialization. This is a part of, if you've heard my talk about the American values from Phyllis Day, this is a part of where these stereotypes come from, that we are taught things. Really, they're almost a part of our fabric. And even though we may not ever remember being sat down and told things about other people, we still learn attitudes and beliefs and about other groups and things like this through observation and through living a day-to-day basis in a society and with people. A prejudice, if stereotypes are beliefs, the prejudice is the attitude that kind of develops from those beliefs, so that it's an attitude of prejudging, as the term implies, generally a negative attitude towards a group or individuals in a group. And a lot of times the result of prejudice is then give the members of the majority, an opportunity to see them as, they become scapegoats really for the frustrations of the majority. And by and large, all racial and ethnic groups view other groups as inferior, as I've mentioned earlier. Stereotypes are beliefs, prejudices are attitudes. Discrimination is an act, generally an act on a prejudice. I'm going to qualify that in a moment, but discrimination is an act of unfair treatment directed against another person because of race, age, gender. This acting out of prejudices deprives a minority of equal access to privileges, rights, and opportunities. And this is really what our semester is going to be looking at for the most part. Sometimes discrimination can be very subtle and even can be legally endorsed, a result of the customs of society. That's where it becomes an institutionalized discrimination. And institutional discrimination is discrimination that is woven into the fabric of society, and is so deeply woven into the fabric of society that it's very easy to deny its existence. And that's why I say it can become legal. Now, conflict theorists are going to tell you, and conflict theorists really kind of relate to the socialist theory and Marxism, believe that the domination by the majority occurs when certain conditions exist. One is a competition for scarce resources such as land or jobs, and then differences in power, both physical power and political power. And the majority maintains that power, is able to establish and maintain that power because they're the individuals, they're the group that has developed the institutions. And so they're going to develop institutions, obviously, that support their own power over the minority. The minority are going to have a very hard time gaining control of those institutions through legal means. And then the third factor that exists when there's a domination by the majority is ideologies of inferiority, such as racism or any ism we're talking about, and that those ideologies justify the actions that reinforce and support the domination. The sociologist Merton is the person who said that discrimination and prejudice don't necessarily have to exist together. A person can be prejudiced but never really participate in an act of discrimination. They hold the attitude but never carry out the act. People can discriminate but not be prejudiced. Individuals kind of belong to a group maybe and just go along with the group, and they're just discriminatory practices because they don't want to speak up and oppose what the larger group is doing. This may be a lot of what's going on in America today. And of course, individuals can be both prejudiced and discriminate, and can be neither prejudiced nor discriminatory in their actions. So the two of them don't necessarily go hand in hand. Just an interesting thought. Maybe 100 years ago, the typical American was thought to be, maybe not even that long ago, the typical American was thought to be middle class, white, English speaking, generally living in a two-parent nuclear family with the father as the head of the household. Perhaps the grandparents came to live with the family as they become older, but generally speaking, it was mother and father and children. The house with the white picket fence and maybe 2 cars. The father worked each day. He went out of the home and worked, brought home the income. The mom stayed home and maintained the home and was there to receive the children when they came home from school with cookies and milk. In 1950, 78% of all households were headed by married couples. But today, the typical American is very different. By 2042, over half of the United States population will be identified with an ethnic minority. And as of this time, somewhere between half to 2/3 of all marriages end in divorce. And there's an increase in single-parent households. 1/4 of all households with children below 18 are headed by an unmarried female. And over half the women work outside the home now. That's also very different from 50 or 60 years ago. And 10% of the population, perhaps more, is probably gay or lesbian or transgendered. So given that, you can see that our client population is going to look very different than it might have 60 or 70 years ago for the social worker of that day. And based upon this, we really have to have knowledge of the specifics of all of these cultures, ethnic cultures, as well as other cultures of the people that we serve. And we should work on developing the skills we need to have to facilitate culturally sensitive, culturally aware interactions so that we're able to work effectively with the changing populations in our work. This requires us to approach individuals, as I mentioned early in this short lecture, requires us to approach other individuals as learners in this process. So just some thoughts for you to carry with you through the semester.